Hello, I'm Rick, and I'm admin for this session with James. Just so you know, the this is being recorded on Zoom. I don't work for Zoom. I'm on the intelligent speech team, but if you have any technical problems or issues, let me know in the chat, and I'll do my best to help you. So our next talk is James from the Other Half podcast, and he has the topic of Sisterhood of Spies, history's greatest female secret agents. So I think we're going to have some excellent stories here. And James was just saying that it's been the topic that he's been covering most recently on his podcast as well. So expect lots of good stories. I'm going to disappear into the back in a moment. This should be about 20 minutes of 25 minutes of talking and then a Q&A session after. So if you do have any questions, just write them in the chat or raise your hand, particularly if you've got a microphone and you want to ask your question by voice. It's really good if you raise your hand, then I can know to unmute you to allow you to speak. Oh, and James has got his drink ready as well, and he's dressed for the occasion, looking very dapper. So I'm now going to disappear.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Rick, for the introduction. As you said, my name is James, and I'm going to be talking to you about some of the greatest female spies in history. In 2010, FBI agents made quite a scene when they entered a chic Manhattan apartment building to arrest a 29-year-old property entrepreneur. She was one of 10 Russian agents taken into custody that day, but it was she, not her companions, who grabbed the headlines. Anna Chapman, originally named Anna Vasilyevna Kushenko, cleverly blended into her surroundings. Even with her thick Russian accent and lack of effort to downplay her nationality.
Sorry, James, your slides aren't being shared, actually.
Okie doke.
Yeah.
How about now?
Just thinking. There we go. Yep. Sorry. Right. I'll go backstage and let you carry on.
Brill. Well, you haven't missed much. This was the first slide. So Anna Chapman, even with her thick Russian accent and lack of effort to downplay her nationality, she seamlessly slipped into the fabric of Western society. She was the last person anyone would have suspected of being part of a spy ring. Yet once the truth came out, she undeniably embodied the classic image of the female spy. She was not necessarily the most talented one among those arrested, but what made her stand out were her looks and sex appeal. And it's that plastered her all over the front pages of every newspaper and on the bulletins of every nightly news broadcast. Espionage is often referred to as the second oldest profession in the world and is frequently compared to the oldest, prostitution. However, whereas prostitution has historically been associated with women, espionage, though the younger sibling, tends to be depicted as a domain dominated by sophisticated men in tuxedos enjoying meticulously crafted subpar martinis while driving luxury British sports cars. The truth, though, is much more varied. Throughout history, numerous female spies have significantly influenced intelligence efforts. Indeed, for Christians, the earliest spy scandal emerges at creation's outset. As one can argue that the serpent in the Garden of Eden served as an operative for the devil, turning Eve into an agent to disrupt the harmony between God, humanity, and the garden. In modern history, Queen Elizabeth I of England famously established a spy network through Sir Francis Walsingham, revealing many Catholic conspiracies. Spies were prevalent on both sides of the British Civil Wars, with Jane Horwood notably acting as a gold smuggler and attempted jailbreaker. The American and Spanish-American Wars of Independence featured numerous women who risked their lives serving both patriot and loyalist causes, from Manuela Sainz and Policarpa Salavarrieta to Anna Smith Strong and Anne Bates. As time passed, roles in espionage evolved in complexity alongside the increasing power of the state. You had operatives collecting intelligence, analysts who convey this information to others, and messengers who relay classified info back to headquarters. Historically, a lot of this necessitated physical travel, meaning that information could only move at the speed of a man or a horse. However, by the 19th century, methods could include telegraphs, radios, or even telephones. And of course, around all this, there are spy masters orchestrating these operations and who also may engage in them. As I previously said, espionage is commonly perceived as a male-dominated field. Typical spy movies showcase handsome male protagonists who rely on, oops, wrong way. Typical spy movies showcase handsome male protagonists who rely on athleticism, intellect, and charisma to achieve their goals. Meanwhile, female characters often solely exploit their sexuality to extract information from unwitting men. This image of the female spy is aided and abetted by the story of history's most infamous one, and that is Mata Hari. Margaretha Geertruida Zeller was born in the Netherlands in 1876. She married a Dutch army officer posted in the Dutch East Indies, but the marriage was not a happy one. And by the early 20th century, she had returned to Europe and reinvented herself as an exotic dancer, calling herself Mata Hari, a Malay phrase meaning eye of the day. She was infamous for her risque performances, which often involved dancing completely naked. She reveled in the independence and freedom this new life gave her, and embarked on a series of affairs with high-profile men, from politicians to senior army officers. To maintain her glamorous lifestyle, she spent money like water. So when the First World War broke out, she was in her 40s, broke, and dependent on the largesse of others to survive. The British and French authorities monitored her closely, worried about what information she might have gleaned from the powerful men with whom she shared her bed. Now, sources differ on exactly what happened next, but it seems that the French recruited her and sent her to Belgium and Spain in their service. However, they soon grew suspicious of her, and she was arrested after being identified as the mysterious Agent H21, whom they had heard from intercepts was a double agent working for the Germans. She was tried behind closed doors and quickly executed by firing squad, despite MI5 asking for her to be sent to England for interrogation. The speed and secrecy of this trial are extremely fishy, and much of the evidence against her is purely circumstantial. Indeed, it was alleged without any proof that her treachery had cost 50,000 Allied lives. And while she had received some money from a German contact, there was no solid evidence that she was working for the Kaiser. Regardless of her guilt or innocence, Mata Hari's image as the seductive, treacherous female spy, the prototypical femme fatale, has endured, and the perception of all female spies as predatory sexual beings has persisted, even though their real experiences and motivations are far more diverse and complex. It's part of their toolkit, to be sure, for spies male and female, but by no means the only string to their bow. Exploring the world of espionage is extremely challenging for a historian. How do you study something that has been intentionally concealed from view? Although some information has been declassified or leaked, much remains hidden. And what stories we have, such as with Mata Hari, can be extremely influenced by various factors like personal perspectives, cultural biases, current foreign policies, and societal attitudes. Before the 20th century, intelligence gathering was extremely haphazard, only growing in importance and sophistication during wartime. So, how have women become involved in espionage if it's predominantly associated with warfare? historically, a man's game? Well, women have rarely been absent from the sphere of warfare. While they seldom fought on the battlefield, women have historically supported armies as camp followers, serving as laundresses and nurses, as well as participating in the sex trade. This gave them access to some information. However, women's roles in espionage are not limited to these traditional roles. Aristocratic women, in particular, leveraged their informal networks of patronage or kinship to their advantage. Social gatherings such as parties, salons, and ballrooms became venues where they could act openly, collecting information through conversations and gossip with high-ranking officials. They often used the prevailing misogyny and tendency to underestimate female intellect to their advantage. And perhaps the best example of this kind of posh spy is Elizabeth Van Loo. Born into a wealthy Southern family in Richmond, Virginia in 1818, Elizabeth was part of a household that owned around 15 enslaved individuals. Though this was typical for families like Van Loo's, Elizabeth was uncomfortable with it. After her father's death, she inherited enslaved people but could not free them due to the restrictive terms of his will. So instead, she paid them wages and helped some of them escape to the north. Her inheritance enabled her to become somewhat financially independent, rejecting societal expectations of marriage and dedicating her life to helping the less fortunate. Of course, all things changed when Virginia seceded from the Union in 1861, starting the US Civil War. Elizabeth wrestled with her loyalty to her state and anti-slavery convictions, but ultimately she decided to be loyal to the United States and not the new Confederacy. As a woman, she could not serve in the army, so chose to become a spy. Elizabeth got her in while volunteering as a nurse, gaining goodwill that allowed her to deliver food to Union prisoners. She and her mother began smuggling messages in and out of the prison. She spent the family fortune bribing guards to allow her to bring food and medicine for the prisoners, often with concealed messages offering escape instructions. She even assisted some prisoners in escaping, hiding them in her home until they could make a break for the Union lines. She spent yet more money leveraging her family's influence to secure favors from powerful government officials. As time went on, her activities became increasingly intricate, leading to the formation of the Richmond Underground, a multiracial espionage organization that aided Union prisoners and supported civilians escaping the Confederacy. She worked with fellow Union sympathizers to offer safe houses, disguises, passes, and guidance for escapees on their journeys to the Union lines. Her family mansion was a refuge for hundreds of fugitives navigating the perilous path north. She ran a clandestine network of spies and informants that infiltrated every strata of the Virginia establishment. She was, if you like, the M of the Richmond Underground. Elizabeth also maintained regular contact with the Union Army, relaying vital intelligence to General Ulysses S. Grant regarding the Confederacy's state and Richmond's defenses. The head of US Army intelligence highlighted her importance, saying, quote, "For a long, long time, she represented all that was left of the power of the United States government in the city of Richmond." She was delighted by the end of the war in 1865, but her subversive actions had taken their toll. Much of her family's fortune was gone, and her neighbors were not best pleased when they learned of her activities during the conflict. Many of her fellow Richmonders viewed her as a traitor to her race, country, and culture, leaving her isolated and ostracized for the rest of her life. She was supported only by the families of some of the men she had helped escape, and her former boss, Ulysses Grant, who made her postmistress of Richmond during his presidency. However, unlike most of the female spies that I have studied, she did survive into old age, living until 1900. Elizabeth is an example of an aristocratic woman who became a spy master, but women have served as spies from every social strata. For lower class women, opportunities existed to work as servants, clerks, governesses, or in other capacities within the households of those they were spying on, allowing them to gather vital information. This work was rarely well documented, poorly paid, if at all, and involved significant personal risk. The First World War saw a great sea change in the professionalization of intelligence work. Women were employed in newly formed intelligence services and as agents in the field. They were soldiers without uniforms, most notably working as nurses in occupied territories. Their work was valuable in life, and those who died, like the next woman we'll discuss, became martyrs to the cause. Gabrielle Petit was born in the Belgian city of Tournai in 1893. She had a troubled upbringing. Her family abandoned her in an orphanage, and in her teens she became a governess and shop assistant and various other roles. However, the outbreak of the war and the German rape of Belgium changed everything. She became a nurse volunteering with the Red Cross and was engaged to a Belgian soldier who was wounded in battle. And she helped him escape to the neutral Netherlands. Her boldness and ingenuity attracted the attention of British intelligence, who offered to train and employ her as a spy, to which she readily agreed. After training in England, she returned to Belgium as Mademoiselle Legrand, tasked with sending intelligence on the German occupiers. She was resourceful and adaptable, employing a multitude of aliases, including as a beggar, barmaid, fisherwoman, delivery woman, anything that would give her an excuse to be where she shouldn't be and see what she shouldn't see. She even ran her own little network with 3 other young women and passed on over 50 intelligence reports, written in minuscule script and placed in a dead drop site from which they were forwarded on to British intelligence. Her career was prolific but tragically short. She was betrayed by a German mole and placed under surveillance. When they observed her leaving a report at a dead drop site, they swooped in and arrested her. She did not go quietly, shouting for all to hear, "I am Belgian. I am a prisoner of the Boche." We cannot be certain whether she was physically mistreated while in German custody, but it is probable. Torture was a common practice among German interrogators of the time, although far from as brutal or systematic as it would be under the Nazis. And although her gender might have afforded her some level of protection, her social class was insufficient to shield her from the worst abuses. Whatever horrific ordeal she endured, Gabrielle betrayed no one and kept her mouth shut. Indeed, many members of her network who were arrested with her were freed for lack of evidence. Her guilt, though, was beyond question, and she was tried and sentenced to death. When the prison priest advised her to write to the German emperor to ask for clemency, she flatly refused, saying, and I quote, "I will not abase myself before a German, even less for the Kaiser. I want to show them a Belgian woman knows how to die." She was executed on the 1st of April 1916 by firing squad. She was 23 years old. Defiant to the end, she refused their offer of a blindfold and yelled out as the triggers were pulled, "Vive la Belgique!" Although her story was not well known during the war, She became a Belgian national heroine after it. She was honored with a state funeral, attended by the Belgian Queen and Prime Minister, and reburied with full military honors. You can see a picture of it at the bottom left of the presentation. A statue was erected in her memory in Brussels. That's one of the other pictures. And during a debate in Parliament, one senator stood up and proclaimed, quote, "France has Joan of Arc, Belgium has Gabrielle Petit." While intelligence services expanded in size and scope during the First World War, and women assumed an increasingly significant role within them, this growth accelerated markedly during the Second World War. Women flocked to work in roles like counter-espionage, cryptography, and were dispatched behind enemy lines to spy on the enemy, most famously in the service of the British Secret Operations Executive, or the SOE. The SOE parachuted over 50 women into occupied Europe to foment resistance, gather intel, and radio it back across the Channel. Women like Virginia Hall, who will be the last person I will discuss today. Born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1906, she came from a wealthy family and attended Radcliffe College and George Washington University. She wanted to become a US diplomat and did work for the State Department, but in 1933, she tripped and accidentally shot herself in the left foot during a hunting trip. Her left leg was amputated and replaced with a wooden one she nicknamed Cuthbert. You can see it on the slide. This disability disqualified her from diplomatic service, and although she appealed the decision, the combined barriers of being a woman and disabled meant that she was unsuccessful. When war erupted in 1939, she traveled to France and joined the Ambulance Corps, perhaps inspired by her countryman Ernest Hemingway. This gave her a front row view when Hitler's blitzkrieg obliterated the British and French armies the following year. She managed to escape to England, where British intelligence debriefed her and recruited her into the SOE. As the bombs fell on London, she became only the second female spy parachuted into Europe, sent to Vichy France, which was then ruled by a puppet government led by Marshal Pétain. Her mission involved liaison, reconnaissance, and intelligence work. Posing as a reporter for the New York Post, she was able to traverse the country, meeting contacts, arranging weapons drops, collaborating with the resistance, and facilitating the escapes of prisoners of war and downed Allied airmen. Her main base of operations was in Lyon, where shot-down Allied airmen were instructed to head to the US consulate and ask for Olivier. She became a vital link between London and the resistance, supplying crucial intelligence about conditions in France and relaying instructions to the network of agents under her command. From 1941 to 42, every British spy operating in France was in communication with her. She advised them, provided forged documents, and aided in their escapes. The enemy knew a skilled spy was in their midst, but they had no idea of her true identity. The only clues they had were her accent, they presumed she was French-Canadian, and that she had a leg disability, naming her La Dame qui boite, or the Limping Lady. In 1942, things escalated when the notorious S-officer Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, launched a nationwide hunt for her. Barbie is reputed to have told his staff, quote, "I would give anything to lay my hands on that Canadian bitch." Hundreds of German agents flooded into Lyon, leading to the infiltration of Hall's network. Although she managed to evade capture, her only escape route involved a harrowing journey across France, over the Pyrenees, and into neutral-ish Spain. This would have been a daunting task for anyone. However, for a disabled woman traversing the Pyrenees on foot, traversing a 7,500-foot pass and walking up to 50 miles per day, it represented an extraordinary feat. That would have been enough excitement for most, but once back in England, she was eager to return to the fight. And so, just 4 months later, she was back, posing as a reporter again, this time in Barcelona. Spain, though, felt too distant from the front lines for her liking. So when the British refused to parachute her back into France, she joined the newly established American Office for Strategic Services, or OSS. In March 1944, she parachuted back into France, so when Allied troops landed in Normandy on D-Day, Virginia and her team were ready. They sabotaged supply routes and engaged German forces, disrupting movements towards northern France. She blew up bridges, derailed trains, felled telephone lines, and destroyed German lorries with her bazooka. After the war, she received an MBE from the British, the Croix de Guerre from the French, and the Distinguished Service Cross from the Americans, a remarkable list of accolades. She then worked in intelligence with the CIA, but desk jobs never quite matched the thrill of fighting Nazis. Retiring in 1966, she made French-style goat's cheese until she died in 1982 at the age of 76. Typically, the end of a long and bloody war sees the dismantling of intelligence services as nations look forward to the pleasures of peace. However, the seamless transition from Second World War into Cold War only accelerated the need for female spies, as East and West relied on subterfuge and intelligence to gain an advantage without bullets being fired or missiles being launched. And even now, after the Berlin Wall has fallen, we're still finding Russian spies hiding in plain sight in Manhattan apartments. From the sultry allure of Mata Hari to Elizabeth Van Loo's strategic brilliance and Gabrielle Pretty's defiant courage, the lives of women in espionage are rich and multifaceted. Their stories, often obscured by secrecy and stereotype, reveals women's diverse roles in intelligence gathering throughout history. Whether leveraging social connections, exploiting perceived naivety, or risking their lives behind enemy lines, these women defied expectations to make significant contribution to the clandestine world of espionage, proving that cunning and courage know no gender. Thank you.
Well done, James. That was great. Really, really good. And incredible, particularly the Gabrielle Petit bit. When I was listening to that, I got goosebumps, particularly at the end where you said the firing squad, and her defiance right to the end was incredible.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I first studied that, the example that you often hear in the UK is Edith Cavell, who was a British nurse who suffered a similar fate, but she was not quite as defiant as Gabrielle Petit. Gabrielle Petit probably had the possibility of surviving had she been a little bit more contrite and a little bit less obvious about what she was doing. But she seemed determined to make an example of herself for her nation that had been trampled on by a much more powerful neighbor. She saw this as her opportunity to really make a strong contribution to the war effort.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking again about Edith Cavell, her execution by the Germans had led to a massive public outcry, and tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of the British public volunteered as soldiers purely on the basis of her execution. So the Germans really didn't want to have to execute her, but she basically gave them no choice.
Yeah, so kind of they saw that giving up their life would be the course is bigger than they were.
Mm-hmm.
if anybody's got any questions, you can add them in the chat or raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, I'll let you speak and you can ask them directly. So whilst we wait for that, I will keep talking to you, James. I think just listening to like the stories that you've told us there, do you think that in media, particularly women spies are portrayed as a bit one-dimensional compared to
I think
reality?
certainly in the past, and I mean I've sort of obviously been riffing on the James Bond stereotype, but just in case anyone asking, this is apple and blackcurrant squash I'm drinking here. But the image of the Bond girl, so in the presentation, all three of the people I've had on the screen there were Bond girls, is often, the first one person thinks about. And I think this is something that's changing a bit. You are starting to see more interesting female spy characters in films. So, I mean, a really good example perhaps would be Black Widow in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, who is a spy, works for a sort of private espionage organization that initially is, again, very much plays on the idea of the sexual spy, and Black Widow, entrapment. That's where that stuff comes from, certainly in the original versions of the comics, but they grow to become a much more interesting way. And if you look at modern Bond girls in sort of the Daniel Craig era, and even, well, actually, no, not in the Pierce Brosnan, those were quite backward. But let's stick with the Daniel Craig era. They are often portrayed in a much more interesting way, much more multifaceted. They're often using their intelligence as much as they are using their bodies. And, James Bond is not shy of using his body to get his own way either.
Yeah, they can be seen as his equals. They're not just a something alluring for him. Okay, there's a question from Steve here in the chat. Now, he says, not sure how to ask the question. In Canada, our most famous spy was Laura II, who overheard American attack plans of the War of 1812 and walked to tell the British, not yet Canadian, are most women spies accidental? And I want to just quickly add to that, because from my understanding of Anna Chapman, who you mentioned first, it seems that she maybe wasn't as sophisticated as some of the other spies and maybe almost got recruited into it for the lifestyle side of things as much. So do you think some are accidental or are they deliberately? I guess it varies with each woman.
Well, I think so. The examples that I used, I will for a start offer sort of an excuse that it's obviously it's a very Western centric, very English speaking world centric sort of presentation, and the series that I'm doing suffers from the same problem, and that purely stems from the fact that I only can academically at least read in English. There are lots of examples that I'd love to cover if I read German or read Spanish in particular better. And also a lot of the examples I use were based around a period of war. And I think certainly maybe not accidental is perhaps not quite the word I would use, because I think they often used, they had their own agency and they made their own decision. They weren't thrust into something for the most part they didn't understand. But I think it's also fair to say that if there was no war, they would not have been spies. Elizabeth Van Loo, if the war had not happened, I think she was an abolitionist. I could see her getting involved. She was educated in a Quaker school. She was a supporter of female suffrage. I could see her getting involved in that sort of thing. But she would not have ended up being a spy for the US government. And I think the same goes, Gabrielle Petit, if the First World War had not broken out, would probably just have ended up being the wife of a Belgian officer, working as a waitress or what have you. And before, she probably would have given up work or whatever. So I think in that sense, I think there is a sort of accident of history, but I don't think you can necessarily say that it was accident, because for the most part they went in, I think, probably, if not with their eyes fully wide open, because I'm sure their recruiters probably glammed up the lifestyle a bit. I think they would have been aware of the risks of what they were doing and of the cause of why they were doing it.
Yeah, and I imagine with a lot of male spies, it'd be a similar situation where the environment, the situation, the circumstances that they are in pushes them almost into this direction. And I don't know how many people actively choose to be a spy, and if it'd be as many men as many women choose to be a spy, and
Well,
half of them just fall into accidentally.
the classic way of becoming a spy is the tap on the shoulder, and you're in the olden days, basically, if certainly the stereotype in the UK is you go to Cambridge University, and then at some point, you're studying some language, and at some point, a man sort of taps you on the shoulder and be like, "You seem like the kind of chap we're looking for." And
Mhm.
I think that obviously happens less in the female sense, certainly in the past. I think it was a lot more people who tended to be in the same social circles, or maybe they came across them in some sort of way.
A question here from Doug. He says, "Your examples are frontline operatives. How common are women intelligence processors like those depicted in Bletchley Park?"
That's a really good question, and it's a fair critique as well. I obviously, in the interest of telling some good stories, you kind of need sort of the sexier, exciting examples. And you're right in the sense, certainly, that although women made up a fairly small proportion of people, certainly parachuted into occupied Europe, they made a huge part of the sort of the backroom stuff, if you like. So that could be traditional support structures like secretaries or other office workers, but also co-breakers, um, people intercepting communications, telegraph, that sort of thing. Um, a example that I was close to including, but instead I used Virginia Hall instead, largely because I didn't want the majority of the people, the women I covered, to be killed by German being their end. Is Nora Niyat Khan, who's a fascinating woman who was a signaler, was trained in signals intelligence, um, and was considered so good that in the end she was sort of promoted from being in the Women's Air Force and intercepting signals and passing them on to, in the end, being parachuted into Europe, where she had a fairly short career before she was caught and executed. Um, but yeah, you're absolutely right. The greater probably impact on the war of women in intelligence services probably was in places like Bletchley Park.
Mhm. Got just a comment here from William. He says, "Thanks for the topic. It's very interesting to me how women became a rallying point for the war effort and their recognition after."
Certainly, I think there's an element of not sure if misogyny is the quite the right word here, but you want to use certainly during the war, you want to use the mistreatment of women, particularly in
Mm.
an era during the First World War, early 20th century, late 19th century, where honor and sort of the right way of doing things was considered very important. And so you could use the mistreatment of a woman was considered far more shocking than the mistreatment of a man. Many men were executed by the Germans, but the examples were like Gabrielle Petit and Edith Cavell were far more greatly emphasized and used in propaganda.
We've got one more question here. It's from Steve, or he's making comments. Just to imagine all of the potential spies in the Spanish Civil War. Because I know you said previously that you wish you could read academically kind of Spanish more. So do you think you'll be able to touch on any of those cases, or is it too deeply buried?
I don't know of any examples that I can do. I've sketched out. So the way I do my series is that each season I choose a topic and then I choose about 10 women to cover.
Hmm.
And so for this, I've done them out. I haven't currently got someone from the Spanish Civil War. Partly probably due to the language barrier. I do it's like I speak enough Spanish to get by on holiday, but that's about it. It's different, very different to analyzing a source. But if anyone has any good examples and a decent source written in English, I'll certainly consider it.
Oh, brilliant. I think that probably wraps up for now. So thank you very much. Do you want to tell everybody where they can find your podcast?
Absolutely. So first of all, thanks everybody for joining and for your questions. I really do appreciate it. This is my first ever presentation at Intelligent Speech, and I hope you all enjoyed it. You can find the Other Half podcast basically wherever you get your podcasts. Also, the website is otherhalfpodcast.co.uk. And before this, I also did previously a podcast called the Queens of England podcast, which you can also find on all good podcatchers.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Steve says, great presentation. Love the podcast and thanks.
Well, thank you, Steve.
So there's going to be a bit of a break now for the lunch or the brown bag lunch. And then I think it's 50 minutes. Fake History Hunter is going to be doing a keynote speak. So make sure people come back for that, which should be exciting. I'm looking forward to listening to Joe speak. And yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, James. That's really interesting. I'm going to end the webinar in a second. Just a reminder, if you want to go listen to the roundtables, that's in another Zoom space, or if you want to the regular individual sessions, you can stay on this one. Just make sure you check the schedule out and look for the links. And thank you very much.